Hi. Today I'm going to talk about Aesop's Fables. You might be seeing this video if you're in the Humanities Part 1 class, or you might be seeing this video possibly if you're in the Ancient Greek Philosophy class, because that's also going to be available to that class. And the reason for that is because what I want to do today is to situate Aesop in his actual historical context, and to show you how Aesop relates to some of the other thinkers of the ancient Greek world. You know, people think of Aesop's Fables, and especially since Aesop's Fables is one of these texts that's sort of been taken to be a text for children over the centuries, which it was not originally, and I'm going to talk about that a bit more. But Aesop seems to be a kind of timeless thing where it's sort of, people don't associate Aesop, that is, necessarily with mid-millennial classical Greece, with Athenian Greece of the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era. But that is where Aesop is from, and that is the provenance of the original collection of Aesop's Fables. And that means something. And so that's part of what I want to do today. Let me get up the little thing here, a little title slide. I say voices of the people. I do. So I want to do two things today. I want to first of all locate Aesop in his ancient Greek milieu, his Athenian Greek milieu. And the second thing I want to do is give you some characterization of Aesop, of what Aesop sort of stands for, what sort of end of things Aesop is on. I subtitle it there, Voices of the People, and arguing really that, of course, Aesop's famous because he has these anthropomorphized animals who are always talking to each other, and as they go through their adventures with each other. And so that's obviously of a great deal of literary interest, symbolic interest, psychological interest, philosophical interest, all sorts of things you can get out of Aesop's Fables. And I have seen some really delightful talks, by the way, from scholars who study Aesop's Fables. I recommend checking out anybody who's interested in them. The Voices of the People, I'm going to argue for actually a slightly radical view here, although I do think it is the true Aesopian view, and that is that there's a deliberate sort of pressing on this distinction that there's some sort of difference between humans and non-human animals, non-linguistic animals. But of course, that's all a matter of interpretation. What we want to do again today is situate Aesop's Fables in its proper ancient Greek milieu, and then take a look at the kind of essentially populist conservative kind of position that Aesop's Fables represents. You see there in the picture the fox and the crane. The fox had made fun of the crane by serving it dinner in a shallow pan, which the crane couldn't enjoy, but the crane got its revenge by inviting the fox over and serving delicious fish soup in an aromatic jar that the fox couldn't enjoy. So now, whatever kind of moral you want to draw from that, I mean, I think, of course, one of the things you should do when you look at Aesop's Fables is not ask what the moral is, but rather see what the moral is that you can draw. And I think a lot of them make you think. And that's one of the things I want to talk about in the slides as we get along. So first of all, some basic philology, just to do our homework here and have our medicine. But this is the kind of thing that we do want to know, isn't it? Philology, the study of ancient texts. So sort of what are we looking at when we look at Aesop's Fables? You know, one thing people don't get about the ancient world is over the span of quite a few hundred years there, through the middle of the first millennium BCE, before the Common Era, about 500 years before the time of Christ, in other words, you have an urban culture where there are these, well, they're scroll stores, really. There are literate people. It's a literate public, and they know about writers from decades and even centuries before themselves. They have access to all kinds of writings. They tend to have scrolls identified by the author and then the sort of general topic. They're not that big on titles, but So around that time, that is around the beginning of the 400s, Aesop living sort of at the end of the 6th century, the 500s, the beginning of the 5th century, the 400s, and notice that 5th century BCE is the century of Pericles, of the Athenian Empire, the building of the Parthenon, and all the rest. So Aesop then is very centrally located. So what happened then, the second bullet point, we say syncretic, the Hindu epics are like this. Quite a lot of ancient literature is like this, for coming out of the oral tradition, when you had just people memorizing huge amounts of material, and they were the scribes, the storytellers, eventually the scribes who were in charge of that, and people sort of add things into these large syncretic works. And the fables, collections of fables were like that. So people would pile in all sorts of fables from all over the place for these editions that they would sell in these scroll shops. Nowadays, in Aesop scholarship, you have, for example, a 19th century compiler named Perry. That edition is the one that people use for the standard numeration. You have to put numbers on them, and people have to have a standard one. That's true of all the pre-Socratics and all the classical poets and all the rest. That stuff all exists for Aesop. And there has been for some time a little cottage industry of sort of picking through Aesop's fables, the various editions of Aesop fables, and figuring out which ones are sort of authentic from that original Greek Homeric storytelling tradition, and which ones seem to come from outside sources, and which come from much later sources, and so on, sorting it all out. So there are people who do that. And so I commend that to you if you're interested in that. Again, what I want to do today is to talk about the original Aesop, the outlines that we can still perceive of sort of what this, at least the Aesopic tradition originally was, whatever, not claiming to try and figure out what Aesop thought, but there is an attitude that is actually quite clear and distinct and locatable in its context. So there was an historical Aesop. He was a Greek-speaking person. You can read about how sometimes people will pile on the animal metaphor with Aesop, and they'll talk about all the terrible things that people thought about slaves. But actually, slavery in ancient Greece was a condition that an ordinary person, or even a person of high status, could, through various circumstances, find themselves in through military defeat or monetary debt or other issues of that nature. So it wasn't like a racialized slavery of the other or something like that. There were barbarian slaves, there were Greek-speaking slaves, and there were laws and rules that to some extent protected slaves from grievous crimes like murder and that sort of thing. The tradition to look at there is Hesiod. Most of us know Hesiod from the Theogony, his stories, his account of the origins of the Greek mythology. There is a video on that in this series. But he also has works and days where he talks about the yeoman farmer and his virtues as a steady toiler in the vineyards of life and that sort of thing. It's all very small c conservative. Hesiod is significant because he is with Homer really very early as maybe early 7th century BCE. And we actually know where Hesiod's farm was. But in any event, Hesiod's works and days sort of celebrating the natural, unlearned, uncultivated virtues of the hardworking country person. And Aesop is very much in that sort of vein, rather suspicious, like great humorists often are, of the modern ways. Then the story of Aesop is that he was subsequently freed from bondage. He's obviously a very brilliant person, became in fact a diplomat and advisor, and then was on allegation to Delphi, where the famous oracle at Delphi is, and told the Delphians that they ought not to pay so much attention to their oracle, which of course was a completely outrageous thing to say to them, who prided their oracular temple above all, and they threw Aesop to his death. That's probably all to some extent symbolic stuff. And so let's look at that a little bit. One thing to understand here is, let me in fact sort of step out of this for a second, because this is important. Look, nowadays, when we think about causation, cause and effect relations in the beginning of the 21st century, we tend to think about physical causes and the kinds of causes that we learn about when we study physical science, like chemical reactions and things like that. But imagine in very early times, classical times, and and pre-classical times, what people understood was that they did things because of the feelings and the thoughts that they had. We can call that intentional reasons. That is, I have certain beliefs, I have certain desires, I form certain intentions, and I do things which reflect my beliefs, but they also reflect my attitudes, my moods, my values, and so on. And so when we're trying to understand why a person is doing what they're doing, we tend to try and do that in terms of their kinds of intentional or psychological states, their thoughts and their feelings. When we look at early accounts of the world, of the cosmos in general, we find that it takes a while for human beings to realize that there might be other kinds of causation. And that's really what we're looking at when we look at these animistic cultures, these pantheistic and polytheistic traditions before the rise of monotheism. That is, you've got sort of the spirits of the clouds and the spirits of the mountains and the spirits of the corn and the spirits of the moon. And in other words, what you've got is an intentional world, where if you want to understand why things are happening the way that they're happening, you need to understand the thoughts and the feelings of this world, of whatever the intentional entity it is that you understand as causing these things to happen, because your notion of causation is basically psychological. And so and so once you realize that about ancient Greek writing, for example, then and particularly prehistoric writing, then you realize something about sort of Aesop and Aesop's animals. I mean, it's not, from our point of view, after Descartes and all the rest of that, mind-body dualism and all this stuff. I mean, so we look at Aesop's fables and say, oh, talking animals, how fanciful is that? But out of this ancient tradition, I mean, I think there's really a different flavor for the reader in that tradition. I mean, there's really an idea that animals actually do represent sort of spirits and kinds of energy that we also recognize in human beings kind of flowing around. So it's not really quite so fanciful as we might think. I think that's something to keep in mind while we look at this stuff. Second bullet point, let me talk about Greek virtue theory just for a little while. Mostly we're talking about what we find in, say, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and that sort of thing. But what does it mean? So the Greeks are making judgments about sort of the overall worth, the overall successful expression of the person, if you will. If you think of, say, utilitarianism passing judgment on the act, or Kantianism, if you follow this, passing judgment on the intention, or the in that sense, Greeks really sort of pass judgment. It's pretty rough ethic, because Greeks tend to pass judgment on the person, whether it's a good person in the sense, Aristotle mentions smart and loyal and all that wonderful stuff, but he also mentions things like tall and healthy, also lucky. So all of a virtue is sort of a virtue. This is what the existentialist philosopher Nietzsche, one of the things sort of grabbed him about classical Greek virtue theory, was that it was sort of, you have good leopards and you have good fountain pens and you have good people, and they don't make this kind of distinction between good in a qualitative sense and good in some other kind of sense. So then, third bullet point, what we have here is the very traditional, the very conservative tradition that in the ancient Greek tradition is mostly expressed in the Stoics, and particularly coming out into the Hellenistic world by the Stoics, is this idea, which is very common to Asian philosophical traditions, which is that virtue is really getting in touch with sort of the rhythms and movements of nature, the movements of the qi, as you would say in maybe a Chinese philosophical context. And so, again, very small c conservative. So that's where the humbling of the ego comes in, sort of the spiritual side of that tradition, that the ego becomes humbled through the realization that everything comes to be and passes away, and we have to live by the rhythms of nature and accept our nature. Of course, in the ancient Greek tradition, I'll mention it a couple of times as we go along here, you have Plato and others, eventually the Christian revolution, which is very much opposed to that and very much a human exceptionalist kind of tradition. Rationalism is a human exceptionalist kind of tradition. Aesop, I would argue, is against that. Aesop, part of the message of Aesop is that we have to be in touch not only with the sort of cold, cruel world and its nature, but the extent that we are also part of that and we have our nature as well. The last bullet point I think is important. Again, in our post-Enlightenment world, we tend to think of autonomous individuals and their welfare and their rational self-interested choices. The Greeks have what I would call an organismic social theory. Because, if you think about, say, social contract theory like Rousseau or Hobbes or something, and the ultimate counterfactual, sort of the people all coming together in a field and agreeing to live in society, right, to protect their own rights, that sort of thing. But, human beings were in groups before they were human beings. Before they evolved into something like Homo sapiens, they were already in groups. So, I mean, the group stuff is actually deeper than the Homo sapiens stuff, really. So that's something that I think commends virtue theory to our attention. That is, it really is, when Aristotle is looking at humans like he does in the Politics or in the Poetics or in the Nicomachean Ethics, he's doing his biological thing. I mean, he's kind of a biologist and he's approaching everything that way because he doesn't think that anything doesn't come under the sort of organismic way of looking at things. Okay. So Fables for a Rough World. And this is another thing. Plato, and then subsequently in the Christian tradition, for two very interrelated examples, there's the idea that the world is essentially a kind of good place. Rationalism, again, has this kind of idea that there is some transcendental thing that kind of makes sense and makes the world kind of make sense. And another sort of flavor of ancient Greek thinking that you get in ancient Greek mythology, and the thing that sort of vexes Plato about ancient Greek mythology is, it's kind of, I used to say Melrose Place, only gods, but that's too old now. So then I say Jersey Shore, only gods, I guess, right? It's like Jersey Shore, only it's gods, because none of the gods are particularly virtuous. I mean, they're just capricious. They're just the gods, and they just sort of do what they want, and it doesn't always make sense. It's not necessarily a rational world. And so the idea of people like the Sophists and Protagoras, or when Heraclitus says, guard your law as you would your city walls, was that human beings had to sort of make a kind of social construction of values. That's Protagoras' kind of perspectival relativistic theory of value. And that's what Plato didn't like, right? Plato wanted to show that the world had some sort of inherent source of value that held it all together. Well, Aesop represents that older world of Heraclitus, of ancient Greek mythology, of Homer, of the gods in Homer. And so that second bullet point, it's a rough world, and these human foibles like anger and pride and the ego in general are just the undoing of human beings all the time. The last bullet point here on this slide is a very philosophical one. And there's just this question. The question, and we can say this is an existential question just to use a fancy word, don't worry about it. But the issue is this: is it perhaps contra Plato, to what Plato would like to say? Is it true that the only time you really have an opportunity to actually be moral at all is when your larger context is completely amoral, completely without morals. I think this is what Kierkegaard's talking about. I think the novelist Cormac McCarthy actually is interested in this for what it's worth. Um, and I think people like Protagoras and Gorgias are arguing for something like this. and Plato, who mentions Protagoras more than any other pre-Socratic in all of his dialogues, I think is arguing um, against that kind of idea. But Aesop is your old grandfather giving you the bad news. You know, it's a rough world. You can't trust people. There's no justice. And that's the world that you have to live in. And that's, I think, what Hesiod and Aesop are about. As to this animal thing, which is very deep and fascinating indeed, um, Aesop, after all, he's a slave. He's chattel. He's property. He's ugly, they say. That is, doesn't look like a person. And they say that he was mute as a youth. He could not speak, part of the legend. And remember then, according to the legend, he's killed at Delphi, right, up near the temple of Apollo at Delphi, the Delphic oracle, um, because he blasphemes there. But this is, after all, a votive temple where people make animal sacrifices. So these are all sort of, it's crusted on over the centuries. This is sort of comes to be the sort of mythos of Aesop. I think second bullet point, we can I say two functions. There's lots of things going on with his use of animals to tell the stories. At some point, somebody, maybe this seems like it was someone still at the point of telling stories and not writing them down. Someone that is maybe in the 6th century BCE, after Homer, but before the tragedians, decided that they would use animals, that they would have their characters be animals, and that our stereotypes and impressions of the species of animal would be sort of tied into the role that the animal was playing. And that was a brilliant thing, because that's what makes Aesop's fables really. Well, okay, so let's just do a little bit on the second bullet point there. In showing that, after all, foxes are sly and turtles are patient, right, and so on, and lions are proud, etc. So again, it's not, it's funny because it's only with behaviorism in the early 20th century that the animals sort of, in a sense, sort of lost their minds. If you look at people like Charles Darwin in his book The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, or George Romanes, another psychologist of that period, William James, what you get is that they just routinely attribute various kinds of emotions, including intentional emotions like shame and pride and so on, to non-human animals all the time. As a matter of course, like everybody always did. As they say, it took some sort of fancy Cartesian thinking, like the original people during Descartes' century too, used to dissect animals alive, the Port Arthur people. And then in the early 20th century, you get all this vivisection too, because you've got these people who think that they know that animals don't have thoughts and feelings, again, which is obviously wrong. So number one, second bullet point, in showing that various animals share various virtues with the humans, they challenge this idea of human transcendence, of human rationalism. And notice the connection between that and monotheism. Monotheism, the idea that there's some sort of univocal one source of value. And number two, in showing that each animal must play its predetermined role in the drama of life, the fables reinforce a traditional kind of fatalism. And that's what I mean by sort of small c conservative. The Stoicism, the positive stuff in all of those, Confucianism, Hinduism, Stoicism, is that idea that there is such a thing as the rhythms of nature, that you can cultivate your ability to act in accordance with them and be sensitive to them. That's the positive side. But then there is that Stoic side, that you also, to be a satisfied being, you also really do need to be at peace with who and what you are. And that can be something that's very, very blunt in the ancient tradition. last bullet point, morality and Aesop, you always notice, what is the moral? I mean, who are the moral agents time and again? And time and again, the moral agents are the empathetic agents, the one who remember that someone else helped them in the past, the one who sees that someone's suffering in the present and helps them now. And so it really looks, and you have to think in sort of, for example, in the Buddhist tradition, you have the idea that the Buddha is going to come back into the realm of suffering until all sentient beings are free of suffering. That's sort of the ultimate altruistic act. And so, and then at the end of that bullet point, the reed and the tree, by the way, is when the reed can bend and the big tree can't. So the big tree breaks, but the reed bends. A lot of different things you can get out of that one. But that's definitely one that is around in Asia for centuries and centuries. So unlikely that Aesop made it up. Again, you can sort them out. But there is quite an interesting debate now because you have after the Alexandrian conquest at the end of the 4th century, the end of the 300s, all the way out to India. And then we know that there was all this interchange between people. So right now there's a lot of scholarship going on about, sort of who influenced whom on some of that stuff. A foolish man kills the goose that lays the golden eggs. Respect the ways and rhythms of nature. It doesn't get more sort of stoic than that. The Stoic isn't someone who refuses themselves things. The Stoic is someone who understands the limits of what they can have. Stoicism isn't necessarily about self-denial in any real sense. It's about the dangers of mental formations that one is in denying oneself pleasures when one is not, or the fox deludes oneself. So there's that element of kind of mindfulness. You always see different animals being made fools of and being made to appear pathetic or making obvious mistakes that we can see. So then what is the teaching here? The teaching here is that we should become more mindful of ourselves this way, our own mental formations. The hare who doesn't think he needs to bother about the tortoise. And so it's really, notice about his negative thoughts towards the tortoise, that the reason that he lost. And giving rather than taking, just as a way of being in the world. Although the lion and the mouse, then later you get a couple that I think are interesting and that we don't look at enough, and they're the last two that I want to talk about. Are they these last two? Yes. These last two that I'm going to talk about then, because they're not as deep as the fragments of Heraclitus in the sense of having layers and layers of meaning. But like I said a few minutes ago, they do sort of, you can't just sort of look up the moral. That's too pat. You have to, you have to see that it opens up some space, at least for you to think, and usually it does. In this case, the wolf had something stuck in its throat. The crane had compassion on the wolf and reached down the wolf's throat and took out the bone, I guess, that the wolf was choking on. And then the crane was still sort of hanging around and saying, well, are we friends now? Are you going to do something? And the wolf just sort of, snarled it and said, get away. What do you think? I'm a wolf. Trust nature to be itself. Trust people to be itself. Can you trust someone? Well, you can trust someone if you know who and what they are, because then you can trust them to be who and what they are. Once you know who and what they are, then you can trust them completely. In what sense can you trust them? You can trust them to be who they are. That's the only way you can really trust anything. And so, so this is the story. Doesn't mean you should never interact with the wolf. The crane did the right thing, but you don't get to be buddies with the wolf. This is one. You see it in the scorpion and the frog. So the frog or the turtle is swimming across the river, giving the scorpion a ride, and the scorpion kills the frog by stinging it, or tries to sting the turtle and gets drowned by the turtle, or variations. The farmer and the viper, it does come from 5th century Greece. So it's almost surely the Aesopian version. In this one, the viper is freezing outside. The farmer brings it in, thaws it out, and the viper's all right again. And the farmer thinks this is great. Then the viper bites the farmer and the farmer dies. And the farmer does realize that it's his own fault in the story, because again, what is the moral of the story? Trust nature to be what it is, and don't let your ego and your mental formations get in the way of understanding that nature's going to do what nature does. So, so just to end there, because you can look at Aesop's fables, um, but two things. Then one is it is uh, fifth century Greek, fifth century Greek in provenance, and very much a part of that tradition, very much related to and involved in the arguments, the cultural arguments that are going on in the Greek speaking world at that time. I think I mentioned on there somewhere it's a little early. Sometimes people will say that Aesop is in reaction against the academics like Plato and Aristotle, or against the new naturalism like the Ionians and the Milesians. But actually, he's a little bit earlier for that. I'd say he's more like Homer and Hesiod. He's coming from an older place than that, and he's expressing values that are pretty well established. Um, but in any event, so we did that, and then as a corollary to that, the other thing that we did was to see what his voice is. He's kind of again a populist, essentially sort of conservative and stoic kind of voice. So all right, so that'll be that. But I don't think it would be good to leave um,